And now I would like to introduce our speaker. Elizabeth Bleuer is a team leader for an organization called Democracy Journeys. Democracy Journeys provides curated trips to places where democracy is being shaped in real time. They provide interaction with journalists, cultural leaders, and activists, and meet them where they live and work, sharing meals, walking historic streets, or talking over coffee as they bring each place's history and culture vividly to life. If you're interested in taking a trip with them, please check out their website, which I will put in the chat after during this talk. Ms. Bleuer previously worked at Democracy International as a deputy director of program management and has more than 10 years of experience in fields of democracy, human rights, governance, and humanitarian aid. Her work has taken her to more than 15 countries across Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. She received an MA in International Development from the Elliott School of International Affairs in 2016. She will talk to you today about what is happening with Kosovo now that the U.S. has pulled back diplomatic and foreign aid support. She'll speak for about 40 minutes and then take questions. If you have questions as she's speaking, please put them in the chat and I will field them at the end of the talk. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Deborah. Hi, everyone. As Deborah said, my name is Elizabeth, and I am here to talk to you about Kosovo as an example of successful U.S. diplomacy and intervention. And even since I sent the bio to Deborah, our world continues to change. And so I'll be covering some updates on the relationship between Kosovo and the U.S., but also how Kosovo, the story of Kosovo, its independence and democracy, really meets our moment as Americans, both looking at home and what's going on here, as well as looking at our geopolitical role in other countries. So in my talk, I will cover a little bit more of my relationship to Kosovo, Kosovo's story, the recent history from being a part of a federalist communist country to an independent democracy, the US's role in that. We'll briefly and obtusely talk about the if Kosovo is a model for the next steps for Gaza, and then we'll talk about why Kosovo's story meets our current moment. To begin, I'd like to tell you my relationship to Kosovo, where my interest and my relative expertise comes from. So in the top left photo on this slide, you see a group of people cutting a ribbon. Until the beginning of 2025, Democracy International, which Democracy Journeys is a subsidiary of, so I still am working at Democracy International. They were implementing a U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID program in Kosovo. $25 million program, and the program was focused on strengthening the relationship or social contract between municipal governments or local government in Kosovo and its citizens. And this here, I will talk a little bit more about that project later, but just to note, this here is a picture of government officials and citizens cutting a ribbon for the rehabilitation of a park, which is a project that they jointly chose to implement with discretionary government funds. As many of you know, at the beginning of 2025, USAID programming and USAID as an entity stopped rather abruptly. And Democracy International, with these incredible connections we have around the world, started Democracy Journeys. And the picture in the bottom right corner is from my pre-trip for our Balkans democracy journey. So as Deborah mentioned, our democracy journeys are small group travel opportunities for Americans and others to explore the democracies of other countries by hearing the stories directly from the democracy change makers, whether that be journalists or parliamentarians or former presidents. And so this picture here is just a snapshot of my pre-trip. The woman sitting behind me, so I'm front right. Back right is Rosafa. She has served in 2 of the highest civilian roles, Secretary General twice for the Kosovo government, one for the Ministry of Defense, one for the Ministry of Local Governance. And I'll be telling some stories about her. Tina is back left, and she's worked on democracy programs in Kosovo for over a decade. And she's actually, her biggest claim to fame is she's the foremost radio host in Kosovo. So she greets all Kosovars on their journeys into the office every morning with the latest news and culture. And then the gentleman in the front left is the head chef at this incredible restaurant that we were eating at when we asked him to take a photo with us. And so my what I'll be sharing with you today is heavily influenced by both the program that I worked on, local governance program, but also meeting with these two individuals, but the former president of Kosovo, the Minister of Defense of Kosovo, in preparation for our upcoming democracy journey. So before we dig into Kosovo's history, I thought it would be useful to put it on a map. So Kosovo is truly in the center of the Balkans. It's right here. To its west is Italy, northwest is Croatia, south is Greece, and then to its east is Turkey. And so the Balkans are really at the center of where Eastern Europe or Europe hits Asia, Western Asia. And the Balkans is one of those regions in the world that has been conquered and reconquered. And Kosovo has both vibes, has both an Asian vibe and a European vibe, and is an absolutely incredible place to visit. Kosovo is the size of Connecticut, if that is helpful. And its population size is 1.8 million, which is about the size of the city of Philadelphia, population-wise. In addition to the 1.8 million, they have about 800,000 Kosovars in the diaspora. Another framing slide for you to really help understand Kosovo's recent history is the breakup of Yugoslavia, which began in 1989. So the brief history of the breakup of Yugoslavia is that Yugoslavia was a socialist federal republic under Tito for decades. Tito died in 1980. And under Tito, he really repressed nationalistic or ethnic-oriented affiliations and really tried to enforce a Yugoslavia identity to all of the different republics, and there were 6 of them that existed in Yugoslavia. And the 6 were Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. You'll notice I didn't mention Kosovo. Kosovo was a region in the Republic of Serbia. When Tito died, nationalism increased significantly, and Milosevic, the new leader of Yugoslavia, was very pro-Serb. And in general, in Yugoslavia, while there are many ethnic groups, including ethnic Albanians who lived in the region that is now Kosovo, he was Serb, and the majority of the population was Serb, and he really wanted to lean into that and have Serbs in really elevated positions in Yugoslavia. This thinking and the rise of nationalism led to many of the republics voting via referendum to become independent. And beginning in 1989, and Slovenia and Croatia were the first 2. Almost all of these breakups entailed some sort of warring or fighting between Serbs, either in the republics or from the Republic of Serb to the other republics. The most notable, of course, is Bosnia and Herzegovina. And from 1991 to 1995, there was an ongoing war that turned into a genocide against Bosniaks. Kosovo's story is different for 2 reasons. One is that, again, they were not their own republic. They were part of the Serb Republic, and they voted via referendum, and the Serbs said, we disagree. And the second is that their response was one of nonviolent resistance. And I'm going to hop to the next slide to dig into that a little bit more. So on this slide, you'll see on the top right corner, this gentleman here is Ibrahim Rugova, and he was the head of the Democratic League of Kosovo, the leading political party in Kosovo. And through the 70s and 80s, while Kosovo wasn't its own republic, it did have agency and authority to run its own local government, which was with 80% of the population of Serbia being ethnic Albanian focused. So kids were learning Albanian in schools. Albanian culture was embedded in government. Albanians were running local government. And starting in 1989, with Milosevic cracking down on other ethnicities and promoting a very Serb forward agenda, he retook those powers from the region of Kosovo. And within weeks, the 80% of the population that was going to school, that was running, that region, were kicked out of their jobs and out of their schools. And actually, Rosafa, the woman who was sitting behind me in that restaurant photo, who later served in very senior roles in government, was 6 at the time. And she remembers going to school in Prizren, which is a city in Kosovo. And on the way there, thinking, I have 4 more letters to learn in my Albanian alphabet. And when she got there were police outside her school, and they sent all the Albanian kids home and said, you're no longer welcome in this school. And when she returned home, her mother, who was also employed and had a regular day job, had also been fired based on her ethnicity that same day. And in the coming weeks, her father, who was a physician, and her aunt, who was studying law at the University of Pristina, which is the capital of now Kosovo, a large city then, were also fired, let go, expelled from their programs and from their occupation. And under the leadership of this gentleman here, a big part of Kosovo's nonviolent resistance was setting up a shadow government. And so if you see in the bottom left corner, this here is a homeschool. So Albanians united and ran a series of schools in people's homes. Similarly, through the shadow government, there was a voluntary tax that Albanians could pay into to pay for services like ad hoc clinics and hospitals. And so for almost a decade, Kosovar Albanians living in the area of Kosovo, who had lived there for centuries, fought against the repression, which was really meant to kick them out of the region so that Serbs could take control, and existed in a state of defiance and support of one another. Towards the end of the 1990s, youth in Kosovo, Albanian youth, were tired of the repression that they were living under, their lack of legitimate jobs and education, and they formed the guerrilla group, the Kosovo Liberation Army, or often considered a guerrilla group. And in the late 1990s, they began to attack Serb police and forces in the region of Kosovo. And unfortunately, the Serb forces responded not just by attacking the KLA, but eliminating entire villages of Kosovo or Kosovar citizens. At first targeting villages that had some sort of affiliation with the KLA. Perhaps some of the men were generals in the KLA, but from there, there were 34 instances of civilian massacres, also known as ethnic cleansing, also the beginning of a genocide. And during those 2 years, 1998 and 1999, over 1 million, so over 50% of the population was displaced either internally or fled the country. And I want to pause in the history here to talk a little bit about U.S. engagement. So Ibrahim Rugova, the head of Kosovo, they refer to him as the Gandhi, Kosovar Albanians do, of Kosovo, wasn't wrong when he thought that this peaceful resistance and show of resilience and strength would appeal to the Western world. As early as 1992, so just 3 years into this, President George H.W. Bush warned Milosevic that, quote, the U.S. will be prepared to employ military forces against the Serbians in Kosovo and in Serbia proper if conflict broke out. And as repression continued through the mid 1990s, the US was beginning to message internally to the American people the imperative of involvement. It was also a really pivotal period, as from 1991 to 1995, there was the Bosnian genocide, just two countries over, where the US and UN failed to protect some of the most atrocious days of that genocide. And then in 1994, of course, there was the Rwandan genocide, where again, UN peacekeeping forces in Western countries failed to respond in a timely manner, which led to very horrific results. And President Clinton spoke openly about his regrets on that, and many times came to the American people talking about the situation in Kosovo. In the late 1990s, President Clinton worked with NATO allies to push for peace talks, and those occurred between Serbia and Kosovo and Rambouillet, France, in early 1999. This is after some of the ethnic cleansing had started, but the Serbs were not interested in letting go of the Kosovo region, and continued during that period to attack Kosovar citizens. And so the photo here on the left is, of course, our former president, President Clinton. And this is the night that he told Americans that that NATO, led by the U.S., was going to launch a bombing campaign against Serbia. And that second photo is of one of the days of the bombing campaign in Belgrade. The bombing campaign lasted 76 days, and it was notable for a number of reasons. From an international perspective, it was NATO's first sustained military operation, and it was the first modern intervention undertaken primarily for humanitarian reasons. And he really framed the decision as the moral responsibility of the American people. And at the time of the bombing, 62% of Americans backed U.S. involvement in Kosovo. After 76 days of bombing, Milosevic agreed to withdraw from Kosovo, and Kosovo came under a UN administration with NATO peacekeepers maintaining security. And that photo on the right is a UK tank rolling towards Pristina, and the Kosovar people, this is right outside of an IDP camp that was outside of Pristina, are cheering on the arrival of the NATO troops. And so on this slide, I'm going to talk about Kosovo's reconstruction and the UN mission in Kosovo. And I just want you all to have in the back of your mind what is happening in Gaza right now and Trump's 20-point plan. And the reason I want you to think about that is an integral part of Trump's 20-point plan is to have a governance structure of international technocrats and actors who will see Gaza or Palestine from the place they are now to a secure, perhaps independent nation. The idea of having a group of international technocrats ruling over Gaza for an interim period, along with Gazans, is exactly what happened in Kosovo. And so it might be helpful for you to think about this successful UN intervention that I'm going to tell you about, and just think a little bit about what that could look like in Gaza. And so in 1999, the United Nations mission in Kosovo was approved under Security Council Resolution 1244. I call it UNMIC. I will also try to call it the United Nations mission in Kosovo, just to be clear. The missions had a very comprehensive assignment with 4 different pillars. So pillar number 1 was to provide an interim civil administration for Kosovo. And that meant internationally appointed individuals were overseeing different functions of government. So that included the mayoral positions over municipalities and positions governing the national government. There was no Kosovar Albanian government that they were supporting. They were it. Um, and so that was pillar one. Pillar two was to help establish democratic institutions, which meant a number of people working on designing the Constitution, designing the flag, the laws, the policies, as well as training local government officials on how to uphold a democratic system. And Rosafa actually, because she served very senior roles in the government during this time, was a part of kind of a working group on the Constitution. And the amount of influence that foreign technocrats had, like requiring in the Constitution significant rights for minorities because of the complexity of the ethnic makeup of the region and of Kosovo, um, really was significant. It was a significant requirement that the international technocrats were making. Similarly, with the Kosovo flag was not allowed to have any ethnic symbols on it or ethnic colors. So you'll notice the Kosovo flag looks a lot like the EU flag. And so very much embedded in those processes. The third pillar was to promote human rights and rule of law. And the fourth was to coordinate humanitarian and economic reconstruction. So just to highlight again, this meant that Western countries and individuals were deeply embedded for years in recreating Kosovo. And I want to highlight that because the amount of trust that was required by Kosovar leaders to allow international parties to help form or direct the future of their country is significant. And the two people I want to point out are Ibrahim Rugova. So again, really the most trusted individual and political leader in Kosovo, publicly supported this effort. And that was so critical to get Albanian Kosovars behind this initiative. And the second person I want to highlight, mostly because I know his story, I'm sure there are many people to highlight, is Anton Chuni. So Anton Chuni was part of the peaceful resistance as a teenager, and then he became one of the leading generals of the Kosovo Liberation Army. And you can see him here on the photo on the left. He is, here we go. He is this guy here. And when talks were going on with Serbia to normalize relations, the peace talks to post-bombing talks, the KLA was not allowed to participate. And when the UN mission took over, they made it a requirement that the KLA, this force that was fighting and protecting, in their minds, protecting their nation, they were forced to lay down their arms and dismantle. And so they also had to make that decision to trust the Brits, the Belgians, the Americans, and the individuals that were being appointed to see their country through to an independent state. And for Anton Chuni, he later became a member of parliament and then became the Minister of Defense, which meant that he had the opportunity to build a legitimate Kosovo army just a decade later. And if you're curious about his face, those are remnants of fighting in the Kosovo War. So I'm going to go back for a second to this slide. So June of 1999, UNMIK came in, and by October of 2000, they held the first municipal elections in Kosovo. And the photo on the left is a picture from those municipal elections. In Kosovo, there are only two levels of government. There's a municipal level, and then there's the national government. And the first municipal elections were very successful. Over 70% of the population came out to vote. And as a result of the elections, a layer of mayors and local government was established, again, just a year and a half after the UN came into Kosovo. In 2001, UNMIK, or the UN mission in Kosovo, introduced the constitutional framework for provisional self-government. And with this framework, they appointed a president, a prime minister, and an assembly. And I should do that in reverse. The assembly appointed the prime minister and the president, and that is the way the structure in Kosovo works. And the assembly is their Congress. and gave them all powers except for the power of defense and foreign affairs. In 2008, or actually before I get to 2008, I wanted to point to the middle photo just to give another example of how complicated this process was. So this middle photo is a photo of the 10-year anniversary of a female police force in Kosovo. And one significant challenge was creating a police force and later a military that the people of Kosovo could trust. They had spent a decade being persecuted by police and military. And one of the approaches that in particular, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, who was a part of this technocratic group, implemented was having women as police force and as members of the police force. And actually, the first female president of Kosovo was appointed in 2012. And prior to being president of Kosovo, she was the head of the police force. And by putting a female face on local police, it helped leaps and bounds for people to think differently about police being a public service and not being something to be feared. So just one of the many pieces that the UN mission had to really think about when supporting a transition to a democratic government of the people. In 2008, so just 9 years after UNMIK came in, the Kosovo Assembly, to UNMIK's surprise, is my understanding, voted for their independence, their complete independence. They basically said, thank you so much, UN mission, you've done a lot, we've got it from here. And declared themselves an independent, totally independent sovereign nation. And this photo on the right is a picture of the monument to their independence. It says newborn. It's in the middle of Pristina. It's a great monument. And this is Kosovars celebrating their new nation. So I want to focus in for a moment, because this is about U.S. diplomacy, on specifically the U.S.'s role. So we've talked about how the U.S. Led NATO in bombing Serbia. They also played a very significant role as a member of the United Nations mission in Kosovo, and continued through 2024 to play a really significant role in the democratization and the growth of the democratization of Kosovo. One way that the U.S. support was really pivotal for Kosovo was within 24 hours in 2008 of Kosovo declaring their independence, the U.S. Recognized them as a sovereign state. And since then, and because the U.S. recognized them, many U.S. allies followed immediately. And since then, the U.S. has pushed diplomatically for other countries to recognize Kosovo, for Kosovo to become part of the EU and NATO, which has not yet happened, to Kosovo having access to the IMF and World Bank, which has happened, and being a champion for the sovereignty of Kosovo. Currently, about 124 countries recognize Kosovo as a country, as a sovereign nation. Serbia is not one, Russia is not one. And related to that, another way the U.S. has supported Kosovo is by continuing to approach Serbia with normalizing relations talks and being a real champion for Kosovo in those talks. If you look on the State Department's website, the State Department says that the U.S. has contributed $2 billion to Kosovo's freedom and democratization since 1999, so since the bombing of Serbia. And this covers, again, a number of areas from economic development to governance programs to educational programs. In fact, many members of Kosovo's governing class, I should say, have been educated, received scholarships to be educated in the US or UK or in Europe. And they also have contributed and continue to contribute to peace and security through a NATO force that is based in Kosovo, and is there to help keep regional peace, but also in country to keep um, some of the tenets of the agreement with Serbia in check. And I can answer questions about that if that's helpful. But I wanted to talk a little bit just for a second about our program, give you a little more detail, because of that $2 billion, there are so many ways, and I mentioned this with the police force, so many things that need to happen in a country for democratization to take hold. And so I'll tell you a little bit about our program and how it's just one piece of that larger picture. So I mentioned that the social contract activity we were implementing, which was a USAID program, was meant to strengthen relationship between local government, which, remember, there's only two levels of government in Kosovo, so local government and its citizenry. And at the beginning of the project, and this was with the help of USAID, we did a social and behavioral science study. So we looked at what the barriers were, why citizens weren't engaging or trusting their local government, and why the local government was being ineffective in engaging its citizens. And we came up with a number of things, including that the communication style of a local government was antiquated and was not reaching people, to citizens not feeling like they're ever asked their opinion besides elections. And one approach that came out of that was something called participatory budgeting. And so we worked with 15 pilot municipalities, and they agreed that for their discretionary funding for FY24, FY25, that they would work with their citizens to pick the projects that money would go to. So imagine Westmore, if you all are in Maryland, I think you are, posting, we have $500 million that we're going to spend in 2026 on discretionary projects. And we really want to hear from you about how you think we should spend that money. And that's what these municipalities did. And through a series of consultative meetings where we worked on their communication tactics so that citizens would show up, to their transparency of their budget, citizens worked closely with their leaders for the first time in many ways to select projects to fund with that discretionary spending. That particular initiative was so successful that the Ministry of Local Governance administration in Kosovo made it a requirement for all of the municipalities to include that in their annual engagement with citizens. And again, I'm highlighting that because $2 billion is a big number. And thinking about just giving one example of how US diplomacy and focus on democratization can make a difference at the local level, in this case, might help understand the very many pieces that go into supporting the democratization of a country. The photo on the right is a photo at the end of 2024 between then the head of USAID office and Kosovo's President Osmani on a $34.5 million agreement for additional funding for 2025. Now, I've already mentioned that, and many of you know that USAID was dismantled in 2025, and all of the projects under USAID, especially around democracy, were canceled. And as was this money. And the USAID had a huge presence. They were a significant arm of US Department of State in Kosovo and disappeared pretty much overnight. And even now, 10 months into the administration, there isn't an ambassador appointed to anywhere in the Balkans. And the State Department has been going through a lot of reorganization. And so talking with our contacts there, they feel like their relationship with the US really has gone quiet. And you might say, and I've had these thoughts too, $2 billion is a lot of money for a small country. Isn't that enough? If they're either going to make it or they're not. And one thing that became very apparent to me in these conversations that I was having is that democracy is a muscle. It is something we practice. It is based on legacy of what democracy looks like. It is based on trainings and education. And in Kosovo, they've had just short of 20 years, which is about one generation of government employees, government servants. And they don't have yet that muscle memory. They're the first to admit it. They do not have it to uh, sustain growth in democracy. And then when you think about all the external actors, the democratic backsliding that's happening around the world and in the region, the influence of Russia and China, it becomes very hard for them to go it alone at this moment. Um, and at the same time, Kosovars care so much about their freedom. They have lived not having it, and they've sacrificed to get it. And so it's been a really interesting time to speak with Kosovars, to hear their story, and to hear their desire for continued support. Now, one thing that has changed since I sent my bio and brief is that this month, just a few weeks ago, the Senate passed a bipartisan amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. This is in the US for FY26. And I want to highlight bipartisan. And this amendment includes considerable funding for the Balkans in security and in democracy. It needs to pass the House. It is not a guarantee that it will, but it was very heartening for me in a moment where our government is very partisan to see that both parties recognize the strategic importance of the region and the commitment that the U.S. has made to date and has a desire to continue with that commitment. I'm going to end with a story. And the reason I want to tell this story is that it invokes, for me, a lot of, or reminds me, I suppose, of a lot of values that we have as Americans of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and of strong resilience. And this is a woman that I had the opportunity to meet while in Kosovo, and there's actually a documentary about her called The Hive, which I highly recommend you watch. It's on YouTube TV, I believe. It's like $3 to rent. But her story does touch to U.S. support for Kosovo. So is a war widow. Her village, Krusha, was one of the villages where Serb forces massacred all of the men and boys. And at that time, most of the women and kids had fled. And so at the end of the war, the women came back to their village and they, for years, searched for their spouses and fathers and sons. And it took a great deal of time for them to find them. But there were no survivors who weren't there when they returned. And for women in the countryside of Kosovo in the 90s, they did not drive. They were not welcome in the business community. And yet here was a village with 50 plus families, and they had no economic resources, being primarily homemakers. And so Farija Hoti bucked tradition, and there was a local, or not a local, there was an international NGO near the town who was teaching women how to drive, and no one was signing up because it was just culturally unheard of. And she did, and she learned how to drive, and she started selling her wares, one of which is Ivar, which I don't know if anyone has traveled to the Balkans, but Ivar is like a hummus of the Balkans made with red pepper. It is delicious. And she started selling it to local businesses and grocery stores. And despite the fact that she was becoming a businesswoman and people found that highly distasteful, and she got a lot of flack for it and was threatened for it, her Ivar sold. It was just very good. And 20 years later, she has employed over 50 war widows from her village in the production of her Ivar, and she now sells it internationally. And when I was visiting her factory when I was there, I noticed that some of the machines had USAID stickers on them. And I asked her about that. And early on in her business, USAID gave her seed funding to buy bigger equipment so that she could um, scale her program. So for someone who's implemented USAID programs for years and thinking about all the different ways the US has changed the story of Kosovo, it was so powerful for me to see, even in this like random case, that this woman made significant change in her community, and there was some goodness from the American people and in in that venture. So to wrap up, I just wanted to loop back to what Deborah was saying at the beginning, is that these are stories that I've had the immense pleasure of hearing. These are a few other figures we have on our tour that we feature. We visit with these people over dinner, over drinks, from the most prominent journalists in Kosovo down here in the left corner to the former president of Kosovo, first president of the Balkans. And so if you enjoyed some of the storytelling components of this presentation, I would encourage you to check out our trips on democracyjourneys.com. And I am sorry, it was a little more than 40 minutes, but I'm now ready to turn it over for questions.
Okay, if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. And in the meantime, I'll ask a few to get things started. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was very interesting. In my former life, I worked on as a consultant with USAID funded projects largely in Eastern Europe. And so I found it very interesting. In your view, I mean, with the dismantling of USAID, it's just so heartbreaking to think of all those, projects being canceled and people kind of left, without, um, these relationships are very difficult to build and to nurture, and then it's almost like the wool has been pulled out from under them. What do you think has to happen in the case of Kosovo to repair things? I mean, will that bill that might be passed be something that will move it forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing that is very unique about Kosovo is that in many places around the world, U.S. influence has been both positive and negative. Um, just based on our geopolitical decisions, it's complicated. And so USAID was that positive component. In Kosovo, our USAID geopolitical decisions have immensely benefited Kosovo. So the majority of Kosovars view the US as their liberator. They have a statue of Bill Clinton in downtown Pristina. Um, they celebrate American holidays, and they truly believe that if Bill Clinton didn't push a NATO intervention, it wouldn't have happened, and that they would not be an independent country today. And so there's a lot of goodwill towards Americans in Kosovo. And it really makes for a unique experience for the American traveler too, because there's just so much alignment and appreciation. And so I actually think Kosovo is one of the few places in the world where repairing relations doesn't take much. Another aspect is that Kosovo is not a humanitarian zone. And so the detriment of USAID pulling out is not immediately and viscerally horrible as it is in other countries. And so I think Kosovo would be is very eager to continue partnership. And yes, I'm hopeful that the US soon finds ways to re-engage on democratic programs, economic programs, and supporting Kosovo's growth both in the region and in Europe writ large.
Okay, we have some questions now. So the first one is, what is the status of the Peace Corps in Kosovo now?
Oh, that's a great question. So the Peace Corps, I don't know going forward what is going on with Peace Corps. But I do know that there are current Peace Corps volunteers, and I know that because one of our clients on our upcoming trip next week to Kosovo is meeting. It was a former leader of a Peace Corps, a country director, and they wanted to meet with some Peace Corps volunteers. And so we'll be doing that while we're there. So I know that they're there. I don't know if Peace Corps is still planning to send folks to Kosovo going forward.
Okay. Someone else asked, did you ever work in conjunction with Ambassador Swanee Hunt, who was active in Bosnia and always promoted the role of women in peacekeeping?
I love that anecdote, and no, I didn't have the chance to work with her.
Okay. Another question is, what is the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia today? Is there any continuing violence, and has Serbia recognized Kosovo as a country?
Great question. No, Serbia has not recognized Kosovo as a country. As recently as 2024, there was concentrated violence. So one challenge in Kosovo is that the top part of Kosovo, it's North and South Mitrovica are the two municipalities, and then south in Kosovo, there are Serb majority municipalities. And especially in the north, they feel that they are still part of Serbia, and the Serbian government also feels that they are still part of Serbia. And so they use a different currency than Kosovo. Kosovo uses the euro and they use Serbian currency. They have different license plates. And so in recent years, there's been efforts by the Kosovo government, very imperfect, by the way. Some of them have been, I think, antagonistic on purpose, to require everyone to have a Kosovo uh, uh, license plate and to use only euro as currency. And that has led to clashes. There also are mandatory seats for Serbia and Kosovo's assembly. And there have been instances of them boycotting their role in the assembly. So relations are not great. There is some concern that this administration, US administration, will seek to solve that by swapping land or municipalities. There are some Albanian majority municipalities in Serbia, and there's again some Serb majority municipalities in Kosovo, which actually this gentleman here, this is a Serb priest who lives in Kosovo and is the abbot of a monastery in Kosovo, talks about how disastrous that would be, because while there are concentrated groups of or Serb majority areas in Kosovo, Serbs are throughout. And so simply swapping land would not solve the intrinsic ethnic consternation that exists throughout the country. And so it seems like we are still far from a solution. The government in Serbia is also increasingly authoritarian and is really having their own internal issues with their citizenry, but it does not seem like Kosovo is necessarily close to either being recognized by Serbia or having any progress with normalizing relationships with Serbia.
Can you talk a little bit about if there are any pitfalls of US support for Kosovo?
Yeah, I think that thanks for that question. I think the overwhelming good the US has done in Kosovo is really seen by almost everyone in Kosovo. You'll go into government offices and you'll see the Kosovar flag, the American flag. This is like, mayor's offices and MP's offices, and then the Albanian flag highlighting the ethnic relation with Albania. From my understanding, there's a lot of criticism about some of the things that the UN mission prioritized in terms of development in Kosovo that put Kosovo at a disadvantage financially, like building new roads between Kosovo and North Macedonia, or through the country of Kosovo. It was a very expensive project that benefited US contractors and maybe wasn't the right way to spend money at that time in Kosovo's reconstruction. And so there are a few examples of that, uh, where international forces, again, had so much power to dictate what happened to Kosovo during that time period. And perhaps, as this often happens, and as former USAID implementers in the room know, may not actually represent the will or what is best for the people of the country you're intervening in. So there's certainly some of that.
Someone is noticing that the website that you gave is a .com, and they thought it would be a nonprofit. Could you talk to why?
Yes, absolutely. So Democracy International is a for-profit entity, and we are for-profit in the sense that we accepted both contracts and grants from the US government. Uh, at the time of all of our USAID funding, about 96% of our funding was nonprofit funding, but we did have 3 or 4 contracts with the government, which meant that um, we had to maintain our for-profit status. Um, Democracy Journeys is a venture of that company or that business model.
Okay. So I think we're ready to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for joining us for our speaker series, and especially to Elizabeth for her interesting talk. I want to invite everyone to explore other programming listed on our website at Chevy Chase at Home, and also consider joining your local village as a member or a volunteer. And thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.